Hello. Um, doesn't look like anybody's quite here yet, but this is really recorded for later too. So I'm going to go ahead. Tonight we're reading chapters 7 through 9 of A Wrinkle in Time. And for those of you who sort of missed the last section, I was looking back over what we did the last time. And in chapter 5, we were talking about the Tesseract and how they tesser, which is sort of going through different interdimensional time frames, and that they do it very quickly by, it's sort of like the short way. So that was the Tesseract part. And then they went to visit the Happy Medium, and that was on one of the islands. And so she sort of gave them a sense of what was coming in her crystal ball. And then the last chapter that I read, they were actually on Camazotz, and they were seeing how society worked in this very technocratic society with all the children bouncing their balls at the same time, the same way. So now I'm going to start with chapter 7, which is The Man with the Red Eyes. Okay. We knew we were going to be in danger, Charles Wallace said. Miss Whatsit told us that. Yes, and she told us that it was going to be worse for you than Meg and me, and that you must be careful. So you stay right here with Meg, old sport, and let me go in and case the joint and then report to you. No, Charles Wallace said firmly. She told us to stay together. She told us not to go off by ourselves. She told you not to go off by yourself, but I'm the oldest and I should go first. No, Meg's voice was flat. Charles is right. We have to stay together. Suppose you didn't come out and we had to go in after you. Uh-huh. Come on, but let's hold hands if you don't mind. Holding hands, they crossed the square. The huge central 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 Intelligence Building had only one door, but it was an enormous one, at least 2 stories high and wider than a room, made of a dull bronze-like material. Calvin studied the door. There isn't any handle or knob or latch or anything. Maybe there's another way to get in. Well, let's try knocking anyhow, Charles said. And he raised his hand, but before he touched the door, it slid up from the top and to each side, splitting in 3 sections that had been completely invisible a moment before. The startled children looked into a great entrance hall of dull, greeny marble. Marble benches lined 3 of the walls. People were sitting there like statues. The green of the marble reflecting on their faces made them look bilious. They turned their heads at the door as the door opened and saw the children, and then looked away again. Come on, Charles said, and still holding hands, they stepped in, and as they crossed the threshold, the door shut silently behind them. Meg looked at Calvin and Charles, and they, like the waiting people, were a sickly green. The children went up to the blank 4th wall. It seemed unsubstantial, as though one might almost be able to walk right through it. Meg's left hand was held by Charles and her right by Calvin, and she had no desire to let go of either of them to touch the wall. Well, let's ask somebody something. Charles led them over to one of the benches. Excuse me, could you tell us what the procedure is around here? He asked one of the men. The men all wore nondescript business suits, and though their features were as different from one another as the features of men on Earth, there was also a sameness about them. Like the sameness of people riding in a subway, Meg thought, only on a subway every once in a while there's somebody different. And here there wasn't. The man looked at the children warily. The procedure for what? An authority, Charles asked. Well, you present your papers to the A machine. You ought to know that, the man said severely. Well, where's the A machine? Calvin asked. The man pointed to the blank wall. But there isn't a door or anything, Calvin said. How do we get in? You put your S papers in the B slot, the man said. Why are you asking me these stupid questions? Do you think I don't know the answers? You'd better not be playing any games around here. You'll have to go through the process machine again, and you don't want to do that. We're strangers here, Calvin said, and that's why we don't know about things. Please tell us, sir, who you are and what you do. I run a #1 spelling machine on the 2nd grade level. But what are you doing here now? Charles Wallace asked. I am here to report that one of my letters is jamming, and until it can be properly oiled by an F-grade oiler, there is a danger of jammed mines. Strawberry jam or raspberry? Charles Wallace murmured, and Calvin looked down at Charles and shook his head warningly. Meg gave the little boy's hand a slight understanding pressure. She was quite sure it was not trying to be rude or funny. It was just his way of whistling in the dark. The man looked at Charles sharply. I think I shall have to you. I'm fond of children due to the nature of my work, and I don't like to get them in trouble, but rather than run the risk of reprocessing, I must report you. Maybe that's a good idea, Charles said. Who do you report us to? To whom do I report you? Okay, well, to whom then? I'm not a second grade level yet. I wish he wouldn't act so sure of himself, Meg thought, looking anxiously at Charles and holding his hand more and more tightly until he wriggled his fingers in protest. That's what Ms. Whatsit said he had to watch, being proud. Don't, please don't. She thought hard at Charles Wallace, and she wondered if Calvin realized that a lot of the arrogance was bravado. The man stood up, moved jerkily, as though he had been sitting for a long time. I hope he isn't too hard on you, he murmured, as he led the children around to the empty fourth wall. But I've been reprocessed once, and that was more than enough, and I don't want it to get sent to IT. I've never been sent to IT, and I can't risk having that happen. There was IT again. What was this IT? The man took from his pocket a folder filled with papers of every color. He shuffled through them carefully and finally withdrawing one. I've had several reports to make lately, and I shall have to ask for a requisition for more A21 cards. He took the card and put it against the wall. It slid through the marble as though it were being sucked in and disappeared. You may be detained for a few days, the man said, but I'm sure they won't be too hard on you because of your youth. Just relax and don't fight it, and it will all be much easier for you. And he went back to his seat, leaving the children standing and staring at the blank wall. And suddenly the wall was no longer there, and they were looking into an enormous room lined with machines. They were not unlike the great computing machines Meg had seen in her science books, and that she knew her father sometimes worked with. Some did not seem to be in use. In others, lights were flickering off and on. In one machine, a long tape was being eaten. In another, a series of dot dashes were being punched, and several white-robed attendants were moving about them, tending the machines. If they saw the children, they gave no sign. Calvin muttered something. What? Meg asked him. There's nothing to fear except fear itself, Calvin said. I'm quoting like Mrs. Who. Meg, I'm scared stiff. So am I. Meg held his hand more tightly. Come on. And they stepped into the room with the machines, and in spite of the enormous width of the room, it was even longer than it was wide. Perspective made the long rows of machines seem almost to meet, and the children walked down the center of the room, keeping as far from the machines as possible. Though I don't suppose they're radioactive or anything, Charles Wallace said, or that they're going to reach out and grab us and chew us up. And after they had walked for what seemed like miles, they could see the enormous room did have an end, and that at the end there was something. Charles Wallace said suddenly, and his voice held panic, Don't let go of my hands. Hold me tight. He's trying to get at me. Who? Meg squeaked. I don't know, but he's trying to get at me. I can feel him. Let's go back. Calvin started to pull away. No, Charles Wallace said, I have to go. We have to make decisions, and we can't make them if they're based in fear. His voice sounded old and strange and remote, and Meg, clasping his small hand tightly, could feel it sweating in hers. And as they approached the end of the room, their steps slowed. Before them was a platform, and on the platform was a chair, and on the chair was a man. What was there about him that seemed to contain all the coldness and the darkness they had felt as they plunged through the black thing on their way to this planet? I have been waiting for you, dears, the man said. His voice was kind and gentle, not at all the cold and frightening voice Meg had expected. It took her a moment to realize that the voice came from the man. He had not opened his mouth or moved his lips at all, and that no real words had been spoken to fall upon her ears, and that he had somehow communicated directly into their brains. But how does it happen that there are three of you? The man asked. Charles Wallace spoke with harsh boldness, but Meg could feel him trembling. Oh, Calvin just came along for the ride. Oh, did he? For a moment, there was a sharpness to the voice that spoke inside their minds, and then it relaxed and became soothing again. I hope it has been a pleasant one so far. Very educational, Charles Wallace said. Let Calvin speak for himself, the man ordered. Calvin growled, his lips tight, his body rigid. I have nothing to say. Meg stared at the man in horrified fascination. His eyes were bright and had a reddish glow. Sorry. Okay. Okay. Meg stared at him in horrified fascination. Above his head was a light, and it glowed in the same manner as the eyes, pulsing and throbbing a steady rhythm. Charles Wallace shut his eyes tightly. Close your eyes, he said to Meg and Calvin. Don't look at the light. Don't look at his eyes. He will hypnotize you. Clever, aren't you? Focusing your eyes would, of course, help, but there are other ways, my little man. Oh, yes, there are other ways. If you try it on me, I shall kick you, Charles Wallace said. And it was the first time Meg had ever heard Charles Wallace suggest violence. Oh, will you indeed, my little man? Well, the thought was tolerant, amused, but 4 men in dark smocks appeared and flanked the children. Will you then? Well, that depends on a number of things. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Flank the children. Okay. Now, my dear, the words continued, I shall, of course, have no need of recourse to violence, but I thought perhaps it would save you pain if I showed you at once that it would do you no good to try to oppose me. You see, what you will soon realize is that there is no need to fight me. Not only is there no need, but you will not have the slightest desire to do so. For why should you wish to fight someone who is here only to save you pain and trouble? For you, as well as for the rest of all the happy, useful people on this planet, I, in my own strength, am willing to assume all the pain and all the responsibility and all the burdens of thought and decision. We will make our own decisions, thank you, Charles Wallace said. But of course, and our decisions will be one, yours and mine. Don't you see how much better, how much easier for you that is? Here, let me show you. Let us say the multiplication table together. No, Charles Wallace said. 1 is 1. Once 2 is 2. Once 3 is 3. Mary had a little lamb, Charles Wallace shouted. Its fleece is white as snow. 1 4 is 4. 1 5 is 5. 1 6 is 6. And everywhere that Mary went, the lamb is sure to go. Once 7 is 7. Once 8 is 8. Once 9 is 9. Peter Pumpkin Eater had a wife and couldn't keep her. Once 10 is 10. Once 11 is 11. Once 12 is 12. And the numbers pounded insistently against Meg's brain, and they seemed to be boring its way into her skull. Twice 1 is 2. Twice 2 is 4. Twice 3 is 6. Calvin's voice came out in an angry shout. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Twice 4 is 8. Twice 5 is 10. Twice 6 is 12. Father! Meg screamed, Father! And the scream half involuntarily jerked her mind back out of the darkness. The words of the multiplication table seemed to break up into laughter. Splendid, splendid. You have passed your preliminary tests with flying colors. You didn't think we were as easy as all that, falling for that old stuff, did you? Charles Wallace demanded. I hope not. I said most of you sincerely hope not, but after all, you are very young and very impressionable, and the younger the better, my little man. I mean, the younger the better. Meg looked up at the fiery eyes and at the light pulsing above them and then away, and she tried looking at the mouth, at the thin, almost colorless lips. And this was more possible, even though she had to look obliquely, so that she was not sure exactly what the face really looked like, whether it was young or old or cruel or kind or human or alien. If you please, she said, trying to sound calm and brave, the only reason we are here is because we think our father is here. Can you tell us where to find him? Ah, your father. There seemed to be a great chortling of delight. Ah, yes, your father. It's not can I, young lady, but will I? Will you then? Well, that depends on a number of things. Why do you want your father? Didn't you ever have a father yourself? Meg demanded. You don't want him for a reason. You just want him because he's your father. Ah, but he hasn't been acting very like a father lately, has he? Abandoning his wife and 4 little children and go gallivanting off on wild adventures. He was working for the government. He never left us otherwise. We all want to see him right now. Please. My, but the little miss is impatient. Patience, patience, young lady. Meg did not tell the man on the chair that patience was not one of her virtues. And by the way, my children, he continued blandly, you don't need to vocalize verbally to me, you know. I can understand you quite well as you can understand me. Charles Wallace put his hands on his hips defiantly. The spoken word is one of the triumphs of man. He proclaimed, and I intend to continue using it, particularly with people I don't trust. But his voice was quaking. Charles Wallace, who even as an infant seldom cried tears, was near tears. And you don't trust me? What reason have you given us to trust you? What cause have I given you for distrust? The thin lips curled slightly. And suddenly, Charles Wallace darted forward and hit the man as hard as he could, which is fairly hard, as he had a good deal of coaching from the twins. Charles, Meg screamed. The man in dark smocks moved smoothly but swiftly towards Charles, and the man in the chair casually raised one finger, and the men dropped back. Hold it, Calvin whispered, and together he and Meg darted forward and grabbed Charles Wallace, pulling him back from the platform. And the man gave a wince, and the thought of his voice was a little breathless, as though Charles Wallace's punch had succeeded in winding him. May I ask why you did that? Because you aren't you, Charles Wallace said. I'm not sure what you are, but you, he pointed to the man on the chair, you aren't what's talking to us. And I'm sorry if I hurt you. I didn't think you were real. I thought perhaps you were a robot, because I don't feel anything coming directly from you. And I'm not sure what it's coming from, but it's coming through you, and it isn't you. Pretty smart, aren't you? The thought asked. And Meg had an uncomfortable feeling that she detected a snarl. It's not that I'm smart, Charles Wallace said again, and Meg could feel the palm of his hand sweating inside hers. Try to find out who I am, then, the thought probed. I have been trying, Charles Wallace said, his voice high and troubled. Look into my eyes, look deep within them, and I will tell you. Charles Wallace looked quickly at Meg and Calvin, and then said, as though to himself, I have to. And he focused his clear blue eyes on the red ones of the man in the chair, and Meg looked not at the man but at her brother, and after a moment it seemed that his eyes were no longer focusing. The pupils grew smaller and smaller, as though he was looking into an intensely bright light, until they seemed to close entirely, until his eyes were nothing but an opaque blue. And he slipped his hand out of Meg's and Calvin's and started walking slowly towards the man on the chair. No, Meg cried, no. But Charles Wallace continued his slow walk forward, and she knew that he had not heard her. No! She screamed again and ran after him. And with her inefficient flying tackle, she landed on him. And she was so much larger than he that he fell sprawling, hitting his head a sharp crack on the marble floor. And she knelt by him sobbing. And after a moment of lying there as though he had been knocked out by the blow, he opened his eyes, he shook his head, and sat up. And slowly the pupils of his eyes dilated until they were back to normal, and the blood came back to his white cheeks. The man on the chair spoke directly in Meg's mind, and now there was a distinct menace to his words. I am not pleased, he said. I could very easily lose patience with you, and for your information, young lady, would not be good for your father. If you have the slightest desire to see your father again, you better cooperate. Meg reacted as she sometimes reacted to Mr. Jenkins at school. She scowled at the ground in a sullen fury. It might help if you gave us something to eat, she complained. We're all starved. If you're going to be horrible to us, you might as well give us the full stomachs first. And again, the thoughts coming at her broke into laughter. Isn't she a funny girl, though? It's lucky for you that you amuse me, my dear. I shouldn't be so easy on you. The boys I find not nearly so diverting. Well. Now tell me, young lady, if I feed you, will you stop interfering with me? Starvation does work wonders, of course, the man told her. Oh, no, Meg said. Starvation does work wonders, of course, the man told her. I hate to use such primitive methods on you, but of course you realize that you forced them on me. I wouldn't eat your old food anyhow. Meg was still all churned up and angry as though she was in Mr. Jenkins' office. I wouldn't trust it. Of course, our food, being synthetic, is not superior to your messes of beans and bacon and so forth, but I assure you that it's far more nourishing, and though it has no taste of its own, a slight conditioning is all is necessary to give you the illusion that you are eating a roast turkey dinner. If I ate now, I would throw up, Meg said. And still holding Meg in Calvin's hands, Charles Wallace stepped forward. Okay, what's next? He asked the man on the chair. We've had enough of these preliminaries. Let's get on with it. Well, that's exactly what we're doing, the man said, until your sister interfered by practically giving you a brain concussion. Shall we try again? No, Meg cried. No, Charles, please, let me do it, or Calvin. But it is only the little boy whose neurological system is complex enough, and if you tried to conduct the necessary neurons, your brain would explode. And Charles's wouldn't? I think not. But there's a possibility. Well, there's always a possibility. But then he mustn't do it. I think you will have to grant him the right to make his own decisions. But Meg, with the dogged tenacity that had so often caused her trouble, continued. You mean Calvin and I can't know who you really are? Oh, no, I didn't say that. I mean, you can't know it in the same way, nor is it important to me to have you know. Are we here? Ah, here we are. Okay, so from somewhere in the shadows appeared 4 more men in dark smocks carrying a table. And it was covered with a white cloth, like the tables used by room service in hotels. And it held a meal hot box containing something that smelled delicious, something that smelled like turkey dinner. Well, there's something phooey in the whole setup, Meg thought. There's definitely something rotten in the state of Camazotz. And again, the thought seemed to break into laughter. Well, of course it doesn't really smell, but isn't it as good as though it really did? I don't smell anything, Charles Wallace said. I know, young man, and think about how much you're missing. This will all taste to you as though you're eating sand, but I suggest you force it down. I would rather not have your decisions come from the weakness of an empty stomach. The table was set up in front of them, and the dark smocked men heaped the plates with turkey and dressing and mashed potatoes and gravy and little green peas with big yellow blobs of butter melting on them, and cranberries and sweet potatoes topped with gooey brown marshmallows, and olives and celery and rosebud radishes and Meg felt her stomach rumbling loudly, and the saliva came to her mouth. Oh, Jiminy, Calvin mumbled. And chairs appeared, and the 4 men who had provided the feast slid back into the shadows. Charles Wallace freed his hands from Meg and Calvin and plunked himself down in one of the chairs. Come on, if it's poison, it's poison, but I don't think it is. Calvin sat down. Meg continued to stand indecisively. Calvin took a bite, and he chewed and swallowed, and he looked at Meg. If this isn't real, it's the best imitation you'll ever get. Charles Wallace took a bite, made a face, and spit it out by the mouthful. It's unfair, he shouted at the man. Laughter again. Go on, eat, little fellow, eat. And Meg sighed and sat. I don't think we should eat this stuff, but if you're going to, I'd better too. And she took a mouthful. It tasted all right. Try some of mine, Charles. And she held out a forkful of turkey. Charles Wallace took it, made another face, but managed to swallow. It still tastes like sand, he said. He looked at the man. Why? You know perfectly well why. You've shut your mind entirely to me, and the other 2 can't, and I can get in through the chinks. Not all the way in, but enough to give them a turkey dinner. You see, I'm really just a kind, jolly old gentleman. Ha, Charles Wallace said, and the man lifted his lips into a smile, and his smile was the most horrible thing Meg had ever seen. Why don't you trust me, Charles? Why don't you trust me enough to come in and find out what I am? I am peace and utter rest. I am freedom from all responsibility. To come into me is the last difficult decision you need ever make. If I come in, can I cut out again? Charles Wallace asked. But of course, if you want to, but I don't think you will want to. If I come, not to stay, you understand, just to find out about you, will you tell us where Father is? Yes, that is a promise, and I don't make promises lightly. Can I speak to Meg and Calvin alone without your listening in? No. Charles shrugged. Listen, he said to Meg and Calvin, I have to find out what he really is. You know that. And I'm going to try to hold back. I'm going to try to keep my part of myself out. But you mustn't stop me this time, Meg. But you won't be able to, Charles. He's stronger than you are. You know that. I have to try. But Ms. Whatsit warned you. I have to try for father, Meg. Please, I want to know my father. And for a moment, his lips trembled, and then he was back in control. But it isn't only Father, Megan. You know that now. It's the black thing. We have to do what Mrs. Witch sent us to do. Calvin, Meg begged. But Calvin shook his head. He's right, Meg, and we'll be with him no matter what happens. But what's going to happen? Meg cried. Charles Wallace looked up at the man. Okay, let's go. And now the red eyes in the light above seemed to bore into Charles, and again the pupils of the little boy's eyes contracted. And when the final point of black was lost in blue, he turned away from the red eyes, looked at Meg, and smiled sweetly. But the smile was not Charles Wallace's smile. Come on, Meg, eat this delicious food that has been prepared for us, he said. And Meg snatched Charles Wallace's plate and threw it on the floor so that the dinner splashed about and the plate broke into fragments. No, she cried, her voice rising shrilly. No, no, no. And from the shadows came one of the dark-smocked men and put another plate in front of Charles Wallace, and he began to eat eagerly. What's wrong, Meg? Why are you being so belligerent and uncooperative? The voice was Charles Wallace's voice, and yet it was different too, somehow flattened out, almost a voice that might have sounded like on the two-dimensional planet. Meg grabbed wildly at Calvin, shrieking, That isn't Charles. Charles is gone. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 7. And we have chapter 8, the transparent column. Charles Wallace sat there tucking away turkey and dressing as though it was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. He was dressed like Charles Wallace, and he looked like Charles Wallace, and he had the same sandy brown hair and the same face that had not yet lost its baby roundness, and only the eyes were different, for the black was still swallowed up in blue. But it was far more than this that made Meg feel that Charles Wallace was gone and that the little boy in his place was only a copy of Charles Wallace, only a doll. She fought down a sob. Where is she? She demanded of the man with red eyes. What have you done with him? What have you done with Charles Wallace? But my dear child, you are hysterical, the man thought at her. He's right there before you, well and happy, completely well and happy for the first time in his life, and he is finishing his dinner, which you also would be wise to do. You know it isn't Charles, Meg shouted. You've got him somehow. Hush, Meg, there's no use trying to talk to him, Calvin said, speaking in a low voice in her ear. What we have come to do is hold Charles Wallace tight, and he is there somewhere underneath, and we mustn't let them take him away from us. Help me hold him, Meg. Don't lose control of yourself, not now. You've got to help me hold Charles. And he took the little boy firmly by one arm, and fighting down her hysteria, Meg took Charles's other arm and held it tightly. You're hurting me, Meg, Charles said sharply. Let me go. No, Meg said grimly. We've been all wrong. Charles Wallace's voice, Meg thought, might have been a recording. There was a canned quality to it. He isn't an enemy after all. He is our friend. You don't understand, Calvin. Nuts, Calvin said rudely. You don't understand, Calvin, Charles Wallace said. Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Hugh, and Mrs. Witch have confused us. They're the ones who are really our enemies. We never should have trusted them for a minute. He spoke in his calmest, most reasonable voice, the voice which infuriated the twins. He seemed to be looking directly at Calvin as he spoke, and yet Meg was sure the bland blue eyes could not see, and that someone or something else was looking at Calvin through Charles. Now the cold, strange eyes turned to her. Meg, let go. I will explain it all to you, but you must let go. No, Meg gritted her teeth. She did not release her grasp, and Charles Wallace began to pull away with a power that was not his own, and her own spindly strength was no match against it. Calvin, she gasped as Charles Wallace wrenched his arm from her and stood up. Calvin the athlete, Calvin the boy who split firewood and brought it in for his mother, whose muscles were strong and controlled, let go of Charles Wallace's wrist and tackled him as though he were a football. And Meg, in her panic and rage, darted at the man on the chair, intending to hit him as Charles Wallace had done, but the black smocked men were too quick for her, and one of them held her arm with her arms pinioned behind her back. Calvin, I advise you to let me go. came Charles Wallace's voice from under Calvin. Calvin, his face screwed with a grim determination, did not relax his hold, and the man with the red eyes nodded, and 3 of the men moved in on Calvin. At least it took 3 of them, pried him loose, and held him as Meg was being held. "Miss Whatsit!" Meg cried despairingly. "Oh, Miss Whatsit!" But Miss Whatsit did not come. "Meg," Charles Wallace said, "Meg, just listen to me." "Okay, I'm listening." "We've been all wrong. I told you. We haven't understood. We've been fighting our friend and Father's friend. If Father tells me he's our friend, maybe I'll believe it. Maybe, but unless he's got Father under a spell or whatever it is, like you." "This isn't a fairy tale," Charles Wallace said. "Meg, you've got to stop fighting and relax. Relax and be happy. Oh, Meg, if you just relax, you'd realize that all our troubles are over. You don't understand what a wonderful place we've come to. You see, on this planet, everything is in perfect order because everyone has learned to relax and give in and submit. And all you have to do is look quietly and steadily into the eyes of our good friend here, for he is our friend, dear sister, and he will take you in as he has taken me in." "Taking you in is right," Meg said. "You know that you're not you. You know that if you've never in your life called me dear sister." "Shut up a minute, Meg," Calvin whispered to her, and she looked up at the man with the red eyes. "Okay, have your henchmen let us go and stop talking to us through Charles. We know it's you talking or whatever's talking to you. Anyway, we know you have Charles hypnotized." "A most primitive way of putting it," the man with the red eyes murmured, and he gestured slightly with one finger, and Meg and Calvin were released. "Thanks," Calvin said wryly. "Now, if you are our friend, will you tell us who or what you are?" "It is not necessary for you to know who I am. I am the prime coordinator, and that is all you need to know." "But you're being spoken through, aren't you, just like Charles Wallace, and you are hypnotized too." "I told you that is too primitive a word without the correct connotations." "It is you who are going to take us to Mr. Murray." "No, it is not necessary, nor is it possible for me to leave here. Charles Wallace will conduct you." "Charles Wallace?" "Yes." "When?" "Now." The man with red eyes made the frightening grimace that passed for his smile. "Yes, I think it might as well be now." And Charles Wallace gave a slight jerk of his head, saying, "Come," and started to walk in a strange, gliding, mechanical manner. Calvin followed him, and Meg hesitated, looking from the man with the red eyes to Charles and Calvin. She wanted to reach out and grab Calvin's hand, but it seemed that ever since they had been to their journeying, she had been looking for a hand to hold, and so she stuffed her fists into her pockets and walked along behind the 2 boys. "I've got to be brave," she said to myself. "I will be." And they moved down a long, white, and seemingly endless corridor, and Charles Wallace continued the jerky rhythm of his walk and did not once look back to see if they were with him. And suddenly Meg broke into a run and caught up with Calvin. "Cal," she said, "quick, remember what Miss Whatsit said. Your gift was communication, and that's what she was giving you. And we've been trying to fight Charles physically, and that isn't any good. Can you try to communicate with him? Can you try to get into him?" "Golly day, you're right." And Calvin's face lit up with hope, and his eyes, which had been somber, regained their usual sparkle. "I've been in such a swiver. I may not do any good, but at least I can try." And they quickened their pace until they were level with Charles Wallace, and Calvin reached out for his arm, but Charles flung it off. "Leave me alone," he snarled. "I'm not going to hurt you, old sport," Calvin said. "I'm just trying to be friendly. Let's make up, huh?" "You mean you're coming around?" Charles Wallace asked. "Sure." Calvin's voice was coaxing. "We're real people, after all. Just look at me for a minute, Charlebus." Charles Wallace stopped and turned slowly to look at Calvin with his cold, vacant eyes. And Calvin looked back, and Meg could feel the intensity of his concentration. An enormous shudder took Charles Wallace, and for a brief flash his eyes seemed to see, and then his whole body twirled wildly and went rigid, and he started his marionette walk again. "I should have known better," he said. "If you want to see Murray, you'd better come with me and not try any more hanky-panky." "Is that what you call your father, Murray?" Calvin asked. Meg could see that he was angry and upset at his near success. "Father? What is a father?" Charles Wallace intoned. "Merely another misconception. If you feel the need of a father, then I would suggest you turn to IT." IT again. "Who is this IT?" Meg asked. All in good time, Charles Wallace said. You are not ready for IT yet. First of all, I will tell you something about this beautiful, enlightened place of Camazotz. And his voice took on the dry, pedantic tones of Mr. Jenkins. Perhaps you do not realize that on Camazotz we have conquered all illness, all deformity. We? Calvin interrupted. Charles continued as though he had not heard, and of course he hadn't, Meg thought. We let no one suffer. It is so much kinder simply to annihilate anyone who is ill. Nobody has weeks and weeks of runny noses and sore throats. Rather than endure such discomfort, they are simply put to sleep. Oh, man. You mean they're put to sleep while they have a cold, or that they're murdered? Calvin demanded. Murder is a most primitive word, Charles Wallace said. There is no such thing as murder on Camazotz. It takes care of all such things. And he moved jerkily to the wall of the corridor, stood still for a moment, and then raised his hand. The wall flickered, quivered, grew transparent, and Charles Wallace walked through it, beckoned to Meg and Calvin, and they followed. They were in a small square room from which radiated a dull, sulphurous light. There was something ominous to Meg in the very compactness of the room, as though the walls and the ceiling and the floor might move together and crush anybody rash enough to enter. How did you do that? Calvin asked Charles. Do what? Make the walls open up like that? I merely rearranged the atoms, Charles Wallace said loftily. You've studied atoms in school, haven't you? Sure, but then you know enough to know that matter isn't solid, don't you? You, Calvin, consists mostly of empty space, and that if all the matter in you came together, you'd be the size of a head of a pin? That's plain scientific fact, isn't it? Yes, but so I simply pushed the atoms aside and we walked through the space in between them. Meg's stomach seemed to drop, and she realized that the square box in which they stood must be an elevator and that they must have started to move upward with great speed. The yellow light lit up their faces, and the pale blue of Charles's eyes absorbed the yellow and turned it green. Calvin licked his lips. Where are we going? Up. Charles continued his lecture. On Camazotz, we are all happy because we are all alike. Differences create problems. You know that, don't you, dear sister? No, Meg said. Oh, yes, you do. You've seen it at home, how true it is. You know that's the reason you're not happy at school, because you're different. I'm different and I'm happy, Calvin said. You pretend that you aren't different. I'm different and I like being different. Calvin's voice was unnaturally loud. Maybe I don't like being different, Meg said, but I don't want to be like everybody else either. Charles Wallace raised his hand, and the motion of the square box ceased, and one of the walls seemed to disappear. And Charles stepped out, and Meg and Calvin followed him, and Calvin just barely making it before the walls came into being again, and they could no longer see where the opening had been. You wanted Calvin to get left behind, didn't you? Meg said. I am merely trying to teach you to stay on your toes. I will warn you if I have any more trouble from either of you, I shall have to take you to IT. As the word IT fell from Charles's lips again, Meg felt as though she had been touched by something slimy and horrible. So what is this IT? Well, you might call IT the boss. And then Charles Wallace giggled, a giggle that was the most sinister sound Meg ever heard. IT sometimes calls itself the happiest sadist. Meg spoke coldly to cover her fear. I don't know what you're talking about. That's sadist, not saddest, you know, Charles Wallace said and giggled again. Lots of people don't pronounce it correctly. Well, I don't care, Meg said defiantly. I don't ever want to see IT, and that's that. Charles Wallace's strange, monotonous voice ground against her ears. Meg, you're supposed to have some mind. Why do you think we have wars at home? Why do you think people get confused and unhappy? Because they all live their own separate individual lives. I've been trying to explain to you in the simplest possible way that on Camazotz, individuals have done away with that. Camazotz is one mind. It is IT. And that is why everybody is so happy and efficient. And that is why old witches like Ms. Whatsit don't want to have happen at home. She's not a witch, Meg interrupted. No, Calvin said. You know she's not. That's just their game. That's their way maybe of laughing in the dark. In the dark is correct, Charles continued. They want us to go on being confused instead of properly organized. Meg shook her head violently. No, she shouted. I know our world isn't perfect, Charles, but it's better than this. This isn't the only alternative. It can't be. Nobody suffers here, Charles intoned. Nobody is ever unhappy. But nobody's ever happy either, Meg said earnestly. Maybe if you aren't unhappy sometimes, you don't know how to be happy, Calvin, and I want to go home. We can't leave Charles, Calvin told her, and we can't go before we found your father. You know that. But you're right, Meg. And Mrs. Witch is right. This is evil. Charles Wallace shook his head, and scorn and disapproval seemed to emanate from him. Come, we are wasting time. He moved rapidly down the corridor, but continued to speak. How dreadful it is to be low individual organisms. And his pace quickened from step to step, his short legs flashing so that Meg and Calvin almost had to run to keep up with him. Now see this. And he raised his hand, and suddenly they could see through one of the walls into the small room. And in the room, a little boy was bouncing a ball, and he was bouncing it in rhythm. And the walls of his little cell seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the ball. And each time the ball bounced, he screamed as though he were in pain. That's the little boy we saw this afternoon, Calvin said sharply. The little boy who wasn't bouncing the ball like the others. Charles Wallace giggled again. Yes, every once in a while there's a little trouble with cooperation, but is easily taken care of. After today, he will never desire to deviate again. Ah, here we are. He moved rapidly down the corridor and again held up his hand to make a wall transparent, and they looked into another small room or cell, and in the center of it was a large, round, transparent column, and inside this column was a man. Father, Meg screamed. Drink of water. Well, you can't even get a cold in Hamazat, or they'll kill you. That's pretty direct. Okay, so chapter 9. This is our last chapter tonight. IT. Meg rushed at the man imprisoned in the column, but as she reached what seemed to be the open door, she was hurled back as though she had crashed into a brick wall. Calvin caught her. It's just transparent, like glass this time, he told her. We can't go through it. Meg was so sick and dizzy from the impact she could not answer, and for a moment she was afraid she would throw up or faint. Charles Wallace laughed again, and the laugh that was not his own. And it was this that saved her, for once more anger overcame her pain and fear. Charles Wallace, her own real dear Charles Wallace, never laughed at her when she hurt herself. Instead, her arms would go quickly around her neck, and he would press his soft cheek against hers in loving comfort. But the demon Charles Wallace snickered, and she turned away from him and looked at the man in the column. Oh, Father, she whispered longingly, but the man in the column did not move to look at her. The horn-rimmed glasses, which always seemed so much a part of him, were gone, and the expression of his eyes turned inward as though he were deep in thought. He had grown a beard, and the silky brown was shot with gray. His hair, too, had not been cut. It wasn't just the overlong hair of the man in the snapshot at Cape Canaveral. It was pushed back from his high forehead and fell softly almost to his shoulders, so that it looked like someone in another century or a shipwrecked sailor. But there was no question, despite the change in him, that he was her father, her own beloved father. My, he looks a mess, doesn't he? Charles Wallace said, and sniggered. Meg swung on him with sick rage. Charles, that's father, father. So what? Meg turned away from him and held her arms out to the man in the column. He doesn't see us, Meg, Calvin said gently. Why? I think it's sort of like those peepholes they have in the apartments of the doors. You know, from the inside, you can look through and see everything. And from the outside, you can't see anything at all. We can see him, but he can't see us. Charles, Meg pleaded, let me into father. Why? Charles asked placidly. Meg remembered that when they were in the room with the man with the red eyes, she had knocked Charles Wallace back to himself when she tackled him, and his head hit the floor. So she hurled herself at him, but before she could reach him, his fist shot out and punched her hard in the stomach, and she gasped for breath. Sickly, she turned away from her brother, back to the transparent wall. There was the cell. There was the column with her father inside, and although she could see him, although she was almost close enough to touch him, he seemed farther away than he had been when she had pointed him out to Charles in the picture on the piano. He stood there quietly as though frozen in a column of ice, an expression of suffering and endurance on his face that pierced into her heart like an arrow. You say you want to help Father. Charles Wallace's voice came from behind her with no emotion whatsoever. Yes, don't you? Meg demanded, swinging around and glaring at him. But of course, that is why we are here. Then what do we do? Meg tried to keep the franticness out of her voice, trying to sound as drained of feeling as Charles, but nevertheless ending on a squeak. You must do as I have done and go into IT, Charles said. No. Well, I can see you don't really want to save Father. How will me being a zombie save Father? You will just have to take my word for it, Margaret, came the cold, flat voice of Charles Wallace. IT wants you, and IT will get you. Don't forget that I, too, am part of IT now. You know, I wouldn't have done IT, if IT weren't the right thing to do. Calvin, Meg asked in agony, will it really save Father? But Calvin was paying no attention to her. He seemed to be concentrating with all his power on Charles Wallace. He stared into the pale blue that was all that was left of Charles Wallace's eyes. And for thou wast a spirit too delicate to act her earthy and abhorred commands. She did confine thee into a cloven pine, he whispered, and Meg recognized Mrs. Hugh's words to him. And for a moment, Charles Wallace seemed to listen, and then he shrugged and turned away, and Calvin followed him, trying to keep his eyes focused on Charles's. If you want a witch, Charles said, I tease the witch, not Our Lady's. Good thing I had the Tempest at school this year, isn't it, Charles? It was the witch who put Ariel in the cloven pine, wasn't it? Charles Wallace's voice seemed to come from a deep distance. Stop staring at me. Breathing quickly with excitement, Calvin continued to pin Charles Wallace with his stare. You're like Ariel in the cloven pine, Charles, and I can let you out. Look at me, Charles. Come back to us. And the shudder went through Charles Wallace. Calvin's intense voice hit at him. Come back, Charles. Come back to us. And again Charles shuddered, and then it was though an invisible hand had smacked against his chest and knocked him to the ground, and the stare with which Calvin had held him was broken. Charles sat there on the floor of the corridor, whimpering, not a small boy's sound, but a fearful animal noise. Calvin, Meg turned on him, clasping her hands intensely. Try to get to Father. Calvin shook his head. Charles almost came out. I almost did it. He almost came back to us. Try Father, Meg said again. How? Your cloven pine thing. Isn't Father imprisoned in a cloven pine even more than Charles? Look at him in that column there. Get him out, Calvin. Calvin spoke in an exhausted way. Meg, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to get in. Meg, they're asking too much of us. Mrs. Hugh's spectacles? Meg said suddenly. Mrs. Hugh had told us to use them only as a last resort, and surely that was now. And she reached into her pocket, and the spectacles were there, cool and light and comforting. And with trembling fingers, she pulled them out. Give me those spectacles, Charles Wallace's voice came in a harsh command, and he scrambled off the floor and ran at her. She barely had time to snatch off her own glasses and put on Mrs. Hugh's, and it was one earpiece dropped down her cheek, and they barely stayed on her nose. And as Charles Wallace lunged at her, she flung herself against the transparent door, and she was through it, and she was in the cell with the imprisoning column that held her father. And with trembling fingers, she straightened Mrs. Hugh's glasses, and she put her own in the pocket. Give them to me, came Charles Wallace's menacing voice, and he was all in the cell with her, with Calvin on the outside, pounding frantically to get in. Meg kicked at Charles Wallace and ran at the column. She felt as though she was going through something dark and cold, but she was through. Father! And she was in his arms, and this was the moment for which she had been waiting, not only since Mrs. Witch whisked them off on their journeys, but during the long months and years before, when the letters had stopped coming and the people made remarks about Charles Wallace, and Mrs. Murray showed a rare flash of loneliness or grief. And this was the moment that meant that now and forever everything would be all right. And as she pressed against her father, all that was forgotten except joy. And there was only the peace and comfort of leaning against him, and the wonder of the protecting circle of his arms, the feeling of complete reassurance and safety that his presence always gave her. Her voice broke in a happy sob. Oh, Father, Father. Meg, he cried in glad surprise. Meg, what are you doing here? Where's your mother? Where are the boys? And she looked out of the column, and there was Charles Wallace in the cell, an alien expression distorting his face. And she turned back to her father. There was no more time for greeting, for joy, for explanations. We have to go to Charles Wallace, she said, in her words tense, quickly. And her father's hands were moving gropingly over her face, and as she felt the touch of his strong, gentle fingers, she realized with a flooding horror that she could see him, but that she could see Charles in the cell and Calvin in the corridor, but her father could not see them, nor could not see her. And she looked at him in a panic, but his eyes were the same steady blues she remembered, and she moved her hand brusquely across the line of his vision, but he did not blink. Father, Father, can't you see me? Her arms went around him again in a comforting, reassuring gesture. No, Meg, but Father, I can see you. Her voice trailed off, and suddenly she showed Mrs. Hugh's glasses down her nose and peered over them, and immediately she was in complete and utter darkness, and she snatched them off her face and thrust them at her father. Here! His fingers closed around the spectacles. Darling, he said, I'm afraid your glasses won't help. But they're Mrs. Hugh's, they're not mine, she explained, not realizing her words would sound like gibberish. Please try them, please. And she waited while she felt him fumbling in the dark. Can you see now? Can you see now, Father? Yes, he said, the wall is transparent now. How extraordinary. I could almost see the atoms rearranging. His voice had the old familiar sound of excitement and discovery. It was the way he sounded sometimes when he came home from his laboratory after a good day and began to tell his wife about his work. And then he cried out, Charles Wallace! And then, Meg, what's happened to him? What's wrong? That is Charles, isn't it? IT has him, Father, she explained tensely. He's gone into IT, Father, and we have to help him. And for a long moment, Mr. Murray was silent, and the silence was filled with the words he was thinking and would not speak out loud to his daughter. Then he said, Meg, I'm in prison here, and I have been for... Father, these walls, you can go through them. I came through the column to get into you. It was Mrs. Hugh's glasses. Mr. Murray did not stop to ask who Mrs. Hugh was. He slapped his hand against the translucent column. It seems solid enough, but I got in. I'm here. Maybe the glasses help arrange the atoms rearrange. Try it, Father. And she waited breathlessly, and after a moment she realized that she was alone in the column, and she put her hands in the darkness, and she felt its smooth surface curving about her on all sides. She seemed utterly alone, the silence and darkness impenetrable forever, and she fought down panic until she heard Father's voice coming to her faintly. I'm coming back in for you, Meg. It was almost a tangible feeling as the atoms of the strange material seemed to part to let him through. In their beach house at Cape Canaveral, there had been a curtain between the living and dining room made of long strands of rice, and it looked like a solid curtain, but you could walk right through it. And at first, Meg had flinched each time she came up to the curtains, but gradually she got used to it, and she would go running right through, leaving long strands of rice swinging behind her. And perhaps the atom of these walls were arranged in somewhat the same fashion. Put your arms around my neck, Meg, Mr. Murray said. Hold on to me tightly. Close your eyes and don't be afraid. And he picked her up, and she wrapped her long legs around his waist and clung to his neck. And with Mrs. Hugh's spectacles on, she had felt only a faint darkness and coldness as she moved through the column. But without the glasses, she felt the same awful clamminess she had felt when they tessered through the outer darkness of Camazotz. Whatever the black thing was to which Camazotz had submitted, it was within as well as without the planet. And for a moment, it seemed that the chill darkness could tear her from her father's arms. And she tried to scream, but within that icy horror, no sound was possible. And her father's arms tightened about her, and she clung to his neck in a stranglehold, but she was no longer lost in panic. She knew that if her father could not get her through, that he would stay with her rather than leave her. He knew that she was safe as long as she was in his arms. And then they were outside, and the column rose up in the middle of the room, crystal clear and empty. And Meg blinked at the blurred figures of Charles and her father and wondered why they did not clear. And then she grabbed her own glasses out of her pocket and put them on, and her myopic eyes were able to focus. Charles was tapping one foot impatiently against the floor. IT is not pleased, he says. IT is not pleased at all. IT is not pleased at all. Mr. Murray released Meg and knelt down in front of the little boy. Charles, his voice was tender, Charles Wallace. What do you want? I'm your father, Charles. Look at me. The pale blue eyes seemed to focus on Mr. Murray's face. Hi, Pop, came an insolent voice. That isn't Charles, Meg cried. Oh, Father, Charles isn't like that. IT has him. Yes. Mr. Murray sounded tired. I see. He held his arms out. Charles, come here. Father will make it all right, Meg thought. Everything will still be all right now. But Charles did not move toward the outstretched arms. He stood a few feet away from his father, and he did not look at him. Look at me, Mr. Murray commanded. No. Mr. Murray's voice became harsh. When you speak to me, you will say no, father, or no, sir. Come off it, Pop, came the cold voice from Charles Wallace. Charles Wallace, who outside of Camazotz had been strange, had been so different, but never rude. You're not the boss around here. Meg could see Calvin pounding again on the glass wall. Calvin, she called. He can't hear you. He made a horrible face at Calvin, and then he thumbed his nose. Who's Calvin? Mr. Murray asked. He's... And Meg started, but Charles Wallace cut her short. You'll have to defer your explanations. Let's go. Go where? To IT. No, Mr. Murray said. You can't take Meg there. Oh, can I? No, you cannot. You're my son, Charles, and I am afraid you will have to do as I say. But he isn't Charles, Meg cried in anguish. Why didn't her father understand? Charles is nothing like that, Father. You know he's nothing like that. Well, he was only a baby when I left, Mr. Murray said heavily. Father, it's IT talking through Charles. IT isn't Charles. He's bewitched. Fairy tales again, Charles said. You know IT, Father, Meg asked. Yes. Have you seen IT? Yes, Meg. Again, his voice sounded exhausted. Yes, I have. He turned to Charles. You know she wouldn't be able to hold out. Exactly, Charles said. Father, you can't talk to him as though he were Charles. Ask Calvin. Calvin will tell you. Come along, Charles Wallace said. We must go. He held up his hand carelessly and walked out of the cell, and there was nothing for Meg and Mr. Murray to do but follow. And as they stepped into the corridor, Meg caught at her father's sleeve. Calvin's here, Father. Calvin turned anxiously toward him. His freckles and his hair stood out so brilliantly against his white face. Make your introductions later, Charles Wallace said. IT does not like to be kept waiting. He walked down the corridor. His gait seemed to get more jerky with each step, and the others followed, walking rapidly to keep up. Does your father know about the Mrs. W's? Calvin asked Meg. There hasn't been time for anything. Everything's awful. Despair settled like a stone in the pit of Meg's stomach. She had been so certain that the moment she found her father, everything would be all right. Everything would be settled. All the problems would be taken out of her hands, and she would no longer be responsible for anything. And instead of this happy and expected outcome, they seemed to be encountering all sorts of new troubles. He doesn't understand about Charles, she whispered to Calvin, looking unhappily at her father's back as he walked behind the little boy. Where are we going? Calvin asked. To IT, Calvin. I don't want to go in. I can't. And she stopped, but Charles continued his jerky pace. We can't leave Charles, Calvin said. They wouldn't be like it. Who wouldn't? Ms. Whatsit and company. But they've betrayed us. They brought us here to this terrible place, and they've abandoned us. Calvin looked at her in surprise. You sit down and give up, if you like, he said. I'm sticking with Charles, and he ran to keep up with Charles Wallace and Mr. Murray. I didn't mean... Well, Meg started and pounded after them, and just as she caught up with them, Charles Wallace stopped and raised his hand, and there was the elevator again, its yellow light sinister, and Meg felt her stomach jerk as the swift descent began, and they were silent until the motion stopped, silent as they followed Charles Wallace through the long corridors and out into the street. The CNTRAL Central Intelligence Building loomed up dark and angular behind them. Do something, Meg implored her father silently. Do something. Help save us. And they turned a corner, and at the end of the street was a strange dome-like building. Its walls glowed with a flicker of violet flame. Its silvery roof pulsed with ominous light, and the light was neither warm nor cold, but it seemed to reach out and touch them. This, Meg was sure, must be where IT was waiting for them. They moved down the street more slowly now, and as they came closer to the dome building, the violet flickering seemed to reach out and envelop them and suck them inside. They were inside, and Meg could feel a rhythmical pulsing. It was a pulsing not only about her, but in her as well, as though the rhythm of her heart and lungs was no longer her own, but was being worked by some outside force. The closest she had come to the feeling before was when she had been practicing artificial respiration with Girl Scouts, and the leader, as immensely powerful woman, had been working on Meg, intoning, "Out goes the bad air, in goes the good," while her heavy hands pressed, released. And Meg gasped, trying to hold her breath at her own normal rate, but the inexorable beat within and without continued. And for a moment, she could neither move nor look around to see what was happening to the others. She simply had to stand there, trying to balance herself into the artificial rhythm of her heart and lungs. Her eyes seemed to swim in a sea of red, and then things began to clear, and she could breathe without gasping like a beached fish, and she could look about the great circular dome building. It was completely empty except for the pulse, which seemed a tangible thing, and a round dais exactly in the center. On this dais lay what? Meg could not tell, and yet she knew that it was from that the rhythm came. And she stepped forward tentatively, and she felt that she was beyond fear now. Charles Wallace was no longer Charles Wallace. Her father had been found, but he had not made everything all right. And instead, everything was worse than ever. And her adored father was bearded and thin and white and not omnipotent after all. And no matter what happened next, things could be no more terrible or frightening than they already were. Or could they? Or couldn't they? And as she continued to step forward slowly, she realized that the thing on the dais was IT, was a brain, a disembodied brain, an oversized brain, just enough larger than normal to be completely revolting and terrifying. A living brain, a brain that pulsed and quivered, that seized and commanded, and no wonder the brain was called IT. IT was the most horrible, the most repellent thing she had ever seen, far worse nauseating than anything she had ever imagined with her conscious mind, or had ever been tormented her in her most terrible nightmares. But as she had felt she was beyond fear, so now she was beyond screaming. And she looked at Charles Wallace, and he stood there and turned toward IT, his jaw hanging slightly loose, his vacant blue eyes slowly twirled. Oh, yes, things could always be worse. Those twirling eyes within Charles Wallace's soft round face made Meg icy cold inside and out. She looked away from Charles Wallace and at her father, and her father stood there with Mrs. Hugh's glasses still perched on his nose. Did he remember that he had put them on? And he shouted to Calvin, "Don't give in! I won't! Help, Meg!" Calvin yelled back. It was absolutely silent within the dome, and yet Meg realized that the only way to speak was to shout with all the power possible. And for everywhere she looked, everywhere she turned with the rhythm, and as she continued to control the systole and the diastole of her heart, the intake and the outtake of her breath, and the red miasma began to creep before her eyes, and she was afraid that she was going to lose consciousness, and if she did that, she would be completely in the power of IT. Mrs. Whatsit had said, "Meg, I give you your faults." And what were her greatest faults? Anger, impatience, stubbornness? Yes, it was to her faults that she had turned to save herself now, and with an immense effort, she tried to breathe against the rhythm of IT. But IT's power was too strong, and each time she managed to take a breath out of rhythm, an iron hand seemed to squeeze her heart and lungs. And then she remembered that when she had been standing before the man with the red eyes, the man with the red eyes had been intoning the multiplication tables at them. And Charles Wallace had fought the power by shouting out nursery rhymes, and Calvin the Gettysburg Address. "Georgie, Porgy, Pudding Pie," she yelled, "kissed the girls and made them cry." That was no good. It was too easy for nursery rhymes to fall into the rhythm of IT. She didn't know the Gettysburg Address. How did the Declaration of Independence begin? She had memorized it only that winter, and not because she was required to at school, but simply because she liked it. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," she shouted, "that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness." And as she cried out, the words felt a mind moving in on her own, felt IT seizing, squeezing her brain. And then she realized that Charles Wallace was speaking or being spoken through by IT. "But that's exactly what we have here on Camazotz. Complete equality. Everybody exactly alike." And for a moment, her brain reeked with confusion, and then came a moment of blazing truth. "No," she cried triumphantly, "like and equal are not the same thing at all." "Good girl, Meg," her father shouted at her. But Charles Wallace continued as though there had been no interruption. In Camazotz, all are equal. In Camazotz, everyone is the same as everyone else. But he gave her no argument, provided no answer, and she held on to her moment of revelation. Like and equal are two entirely different things, and for the moment she had escaped from the power of IT. But how? She knew that her own puny little brain was no match for this great bodiless, pulsing, writhing mass on the round dais, and she shuddered as she looked at IT. In the lab at school, there was a human brain preserved in formaldehyde, and the seniors preparing for college had to take it out and look at it and study it. And Meg had felt that when that day came, she would never be able to endure it. But now she thought if only she had dissecting knife, she would slash at IT, cutting ruthlessly through the cerebellum and cerebrum. And words spoke within her directly this time, and not through Charles. Don't you realize that if you destroy me, you also destroy your little brother? If that great brain were crushed, would every mind under IT's control on Camazotz die too? And Charles Wallace and the man with the red eyes and the man who ran the #1 spelling machine on the 2nd grade level, and all the children playing ball and skipping rope, and all the mothers and the men and the women going in and out of the buildings. Was their life completely dependent on IT? Were they beyond all possibility of salvation? And she felt the brain reaching again at her as she let her stubborn control slip, and red fog glazed her eyes, and faintly she heard her father's voice, though she knew he was shouting at the top of his lungs, "The periodic table of elements, Meg, say it." And a picture flashed into her mind of winter evenings spent sitting before the open fire, studying with her father. Hydrogen, helium, she started obediently. Keep them in their proper atomic order. What's next? She knew it. Yes, lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine. She shouted the words at her father and turned away from IT. Neon, sodium, magnesium, aluminum, silicon, phosphorus. Too rhythmical, her father shouted. What's the square root of 5? For a moment, she was able to concentrate. Rack your brain, Meg. Don't let IT rack them. The square root of 5 is 2.236, she cried triumphantly, because 2.236 times 2.236 equals 5. What is the square root of 7? The square root of 7 is... And she broke off. She wasn't holding out. IT was getting at her, and she couldn't concentrate, not even on math. And soon she, too, would be absorbed in IT, and she would be an IT. Tesser, sir, she heard Calvin's voice through the red darkness. Tesser. And she felt her father grab her by the wrist, and there was a terrible jerk that seemed to break every bone in her body, and then the dark nothing of tessering. And if tessering was with Ms. Whatsit, Ms. Who, and Ms. Which had been a strange and fearful experience, it was nothing like tessering with her father. After all, Ms. Which was experienced at it, and Mr. Murray, how did he know anything about it at all? Meg felt that she was being torn apart by a whirlwind. She was lost in agony of pain that finally dissolved into darkness of complete unconsciousness. And that is the end of the reading for tonight. But wow, that was pretty shocking. The brain, the world brain. I've read this book like 4 times, and I never really remembered that it was a quivering brain. But there we are. And how about the man with the laser eyes, right? It's all of those Bitcoin people with the laser eyes. They've gotten caught by IT and the global brain. So anyway, be sure to check out my latest blog post. I have a really good one about the California digital identity and the soul-bound tokens. So yeah, please check it out. Please share it. It's important. And it's all related to the global brain and the blockchain hive mind consciousness. So, all right. Good night, everybody.